Hi, I'm Patrick, and welcome to the second lecture on comparative politics. Now, in the first lecture on the course, I explained to you a little bit about the why of comparative politics. So why are we actually using the comparative method? Why is it a good idea? And what can it do for us? Remember, we talked about things like we can more accurately describe the world, we might be able to explain the world, simplify it, and so on. All the way down to maybe even governing the world is easier or maybe only even possible if we know where we are compared to others. So what we'll do today is we will go from the why of comparative politics, so why should you even care, to the what and how. Now, I hope I've convinced you that comparing is a powerful tool in your arsenal. So what we'll do today is we will look at how we go about that. What do we actually compare? How do we compare it? How do we pick our cases, and similar things. So let's remind ourselves really briefly that the comparative method, the key purpose of it is to explain patterns, identify them first, and then explain them once we've identified them. So we look across time and across space. We identify which things are similar, which things are different, and the resulting patterns, how do we explain those then? And as Schmitter has put this, and this is just a restatement of a slide from the earlier lecture, comparative politics is an analytical effort to exploit similarities and differences between political units as a basis for developing theory, that's important, for testing hypotheses, for inferring causality, and producing generalizations. So we take political units, and we'll talk about what those political units might be in just a second. We compare them across time and across space, and whatever patterns result from that, we try to explain. So far that's pretty straightforward. What we need to understand is that comparative politics is theoretically extremely diverse. So there's a ton of different approaches in comparative politics, all of which try to explain, for the most part, their little niche of the political spectrum, of political phenomena that are out there in the world. I've just given you a few. I want to say this comes from the Lim book, I think, that's on the possible purchases on your list. So this goes all the way from corporatism, Marxism, pluralism, feminism, post-structuralism, rational choice, world systems theory, and so on. And of course, there's many more than just these. I want to say this is probably 20 or so. There's probably more approaches in comparative politics. So because this is all such a big salad of theories, it's not quite as nice as in IR, where you basically have, 3 or 4 dominant strands of the theory, and then other ones kind of grouped around that. Here, it's very much one big salad bowl. It's often easier to think of these as being in specific categories of theories. So one of the popular ways to distinguish different theories of comparative politics from each other and to sort like to like is to distinguish theories that are emphasizing the micro level versus those emphasizing the meso level versus those emphasizing the macro level. And we'll talk about this in just a second, what that all means. And maybe the most common way to distinguish what theories of comparative politics are pointing to as their explanations is to distinguish theories that are focused on structure versus theories that are focused on agency. So Lim makes this really clear in his little chapter that I believe is on the recommended or the required readings for this week. Might be in the recommended ones, not in the required ones. So he categorizes theories of comparative politics into 3 broad strands. So the first type of theory are theories that are built on rationality. Now, for each of these points, and I'm going to make 3 points in total here as 3 suggested categories, you should ask yourself, is that how I see politics? When I look at politics and I want to explain something that puzzles me, or I want to explain something that's going on, is this what I'm looking at first? Are these the types of explanations that I feel drawn to? And maybe you can sort yourself into a category too. And who knows if that's the same category once the course is over. So the first is theories that emphasize the role of rationality. So in these types of theories, the focus tends to be on individuals. Doesn't necessarily always mean individuals as in one person. Could also be, say, an individual party, for example. But the focus is on self-interested individuals, individual little actors that are then interacting with each other. And because they have different preferences, different goals, these fairly simplified actors can then generate really complex results because there's a lot of them interacting, and the interactions themselves are far more complex than the preferences of the individual actors might imply. So in these types of theories that are built on rationality, it is that the outcomes tend to be shaped by whatever the individual actors' constraints are in terms of economic and institutional factors. So these types of theories, for example, would look at political phenomena, and they would first look at individuals. How did individuals contribute to this phenomena coming about? And maybe if we want to explain a specific phenomenon, we should first start with individuals. So theories that are built on rationality, for example, would probably might explain negotiations between states, for example, or differences between how states negotiate, to differences between the individuals that are leading those states and what their preferences are, for example, and how they are approaching negotiations. So, for example, theories that are comfortable with comparing different US presidents or UK prime ministers and their different styles and of negotiation and their preferences, those would be theories that would be focused on rationality. And then they would then show that how each actor acts is dependent on what kind of economic resources they have and by which institutional constraints they are bound. The more resources you have and the less bound you are, the more you will be able to influence outcomes. So you could be someone that first looks at rationality, or are you someone that looks at structure first? So do you think that outcomes are primarily determined by larger societal structures, and it's not just, billiard ball-like actors interacting like atoms in an almost empty universe? So in theories that emphasize the role of structure, relationships are really central. So how the system is built up, how the rules are being set, and how interdependencies affect how individuals act within these structures. So if we wanted to explain a particular outcome or a behavior by actors, we would first look at the larger political, economic, social, structural constraints. So in this type of theory, we would argue, it doesn't really matter necessarily how many resources you have individually. It matters more where you fit into the larger structures and how the larger structures constrain you. You might be comfortable subscribing to this type of explanation if you think, for example, that there is oppressive structures in society that keep certain people, for example, out of politics. And in those cases, it's very much, you would depend a lot less on suggestions as to how much individual resources these people have. So if you have oppressed minorities, for example, it oftentimes doesn't really matter how much educational achievement you have or how many material resources you have. You will still be structurally excluded from certain decision-making procedures. So those are theories built on structure. And then we have theories built on culture. And I mean, this is a bit of a broad umbrella, but what the idea is here is this is closest to what we've learned about constructivism maybe in our lectures on ISEB last year, in that how you act is dependent on the values, the ideas, the beliefs that you've learned and internalized. So rather than just making individual self-interested assumptions about the world, so just a homo economicus, like we called it back in that lecture, or rather than you just being constrained by the structures around you and your individual qualities almost don't matter, here it is the interaction between those two things. So the individual and the structure are mutually constitutive. So the structure determines what values you have and say what values you grew up with, and then in acting inside that structure and trying to externalize your values and your beliefs, that means you are reinforcing the structure that trained you in the first place. So that's the mutual constitution of both of those things. The structure makes you, and then in living and acting, you remake the structure. And so here, in this particular case, you would be, as a political actor, constrained by ideas about appropriate behavior, rather than, say, about you making decisions purely based on economic factors, or you purely being constrained by the structures, rules, and institutions around you. And this, of course, can be fluid. Like we learned in constructivism, the world is not set. The world can change over time. And while the structure makes you and you remake the structure, that reconstitution isn't perfect and can change from time to time. So these are the three broad categories of sort of theories in comparative politics. So theories that emphasize rationality, theories that emphasize structure, and theories that emphasize culture. And again, these are rough categories, but whenever you encounter a theory, see if you can fit it into these particular categories, and that sometimes helps you understand more what its broader worldview is. Now, we'll do this relatively quickly, and forgive me to everyone who's been on Politics in a Changing World, the first year course, because you might have heard something similar from me in this regard. But let's just do a very quick recap of how variables and hypotheses work, because those are core concepts that will come up all the way throughout the course. And I mean, you can probably listen to this at 1.5 speed if you can. I'm going to try to not talk too fast. But it's important that we get this straight. Now, dependent and independent variables. So dependent variables refer in any research design to the outcome that you're interested in. So in a theory, there will always be dependent variables and independent variables. So how a theory explains the world will have those two elements. What outcome are you interested in is your dependent variable. Now, if you look at all of those 5 possible questions here, take a second, maybe pause the video and see for each of these sentences. Each of these is essentially a political science or a comparative politics question. Which of these is the dependent variable in these particular sentences? If you picked these factors, you're in luck. So, for example, for the first question, do perceptions of economic competence determine electoral success? So is it important that voters think that you are competent on the economy, that you do a good job creating jobs, that you're generally good with business, and so on? And does that really make a tangible difference in how well you perform at elections? So in this case, it would be electoral success. That's the outcome that we're trying to explain. The second one is a little bit more tricky, maybe. Do low taxes make people happy? In this case, it's people's happiness, however we could measure this. And another example here for question 3. The dependent variable here is probably fairly straightforward because it's more or less stated really explicitly here. It's the level of democracy, essentially, or the existence, the presence of democracy or not. So let's move to our independent variables then, our causal factors. We know what the outcomes are that we're trying to explain. So what are those explanatory factors that could determine these outcomes? Go through these 5 questions and see if you can identify what is the independent variable in each of these. Okay, I hope you picked these. So in the first question, it is perceptions of economic competence, because those are supposed to determine electoral success. The second one is low taxes, because that somehow is supposed to correlate with people's happiness. The third one might actually be a little bit difficult because it's an open-ended question, essentially. Why are some countries democratic and others are not? The why is essentially our independent variable. It is whatever we find that could explain the differences here between democratic and non-democratic countries. So that's dependent and independent variables. So let's just put everything together here in a little fantasy theory, just so that we run through this idea of what variables are, how they fit with hypotheses and all that in a random example. Last night when I had a couple of ciders, this is what I came up with. My theory is that people's basic needs have to be fulfilled and then they will also be happy with their political system. It's essentially the happy peace theory, where I'm trying to explain why revolutions happen sometimes and they don't happen at other times, or in other countries, I should rather say. So if that's my theory, if that's my broader story about how the world works, what's the testable prediction here? So I think first we have to think a little more closely about what people's basic needs are. I've just restated this in hypothesis 1 as citizens have to be healthy and wealthy. I think you need wealth and health to fulfill your basic needs. If you have both of those things, you're probably going to be fine. I don't think you really need much more. And being happy with your political system, that's also a little bit mushy, so let's make that more concrete. Let's just say that where people's basic needs are fulfilled, there will not be revolutions. So the likelihood of experiencing revolutions is going to be the other part of that hypothesis. So again, let's break it down into independent and dependent variables. My independent variables here are health and wealth. And the idea here is that we're not done when we've determined that people have to be healthy and wealthy. We also have to come up with measurements, right? We have to assign numbers to these things. Otherwise, we can compare this across the world, which is, of course, what we're trying to do. So for wealth, I used a really simple measurement. It's just GDP per capita. And I used the year 2000 because that's the first thing I clicked on. For health, I was thinking, how the hell can I measure wealth? How the hell can I measure health? And I just used a universal healthcare system. So I think that in countries where there's universal basic healthcare, freely accessible to all citizens or all people that live there, I think that really will mean that the general population is going to be healthy. In countries where that's not the case, there will always be a lot of unhealthy people. And again, because I've already picked the year 2000 for the GDP per capita, I'm also picking the year 2000 here for the presence of a universal healthcare system. Those are my independent variables. So my dependent variable, revolution, how do I measure that? Well, I don't really want to go back 100 years because I'm kind of lazy. So I've just looked at, has there been a revolution since 1980? That just seemed like a good rough estimate. That's been like 40 years, that should be enough if my theory is correct to show something. Now, the next step is, of course, picking cases. So I've picked 4 cases completely randomly and fully without bias. Of course, I have picked the countries of Cuba, Haiti, Spain, and the US. Just happens to be 3 Spanish-speaking countries. I guess that just kind of happened. If we look at the wealth variable, where do those countries end up? We clearly have 2 countries that are rather wealthy. That's Spain and the US, who have a high GDP per capita. And we have 2 countries that are clearly rather poor. That's Cuba and Haiti, with GDPs of under $3,000 and even under $500 per capita per year. Healthcare on the other side, that's a bit of a more varied picture maybe. Again, we have 2 countries that do have universal healthcare, and that is Spain and Cuba. You're probably aware that the Cuban healthcare system is actually very good. They're producing a lot of doctors. There has been, over the past decades, lots of Americans that have actually gone to Cuba because it's more, even though they're not allowed to, but they have still gone there to get medical procedures that they couldn't otherwise afford in the US. That brings us to the US, which doesn't have a universal healthcare system, and Haiti also doesn't have one for different reasons, though mostly for the reasons of resources. So we've established who is wealthy and who is healthy, and to what degree. And now let's look at our dependent variable, the revolutions. Now, if we look at revolutions since 1980, we see fairly quickly that neither Cuba nor Spain nor the US has had any revolutions since 1980, but Haiti has had not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 revolutions since 1980 and 86, 88, 91, and 2004. So clearly that country is fairly unstable. And if my theory about the happy peace is true, that is because people's basic needs are not fulfilled. And that's why they're trying to do away with their political system every couple of years. So because we're political scientists, we have to put everything in nice tables. Once it's a table, it becomes true, basically automatically. If we then look at our variables here, we just make pluses and minuses based on are people that are wealthy or are people that are healthy. We can look at Cuba, Haiti, Spain, and the US, and we see, surprisingly, that in the case where both health and wealth are not at levels that fulfill people's basic needs, then we also have a revolution. So you have to be poor and you have to be unhealthy, and then we would expect a revolution to happen. We see in other cases, like in Cuba, where people are poor but they have good healthcare, no revolution. We also see countries like the US that are very wealthy but don't have universal healthcare. We also don't see a revolution. It's only in the case where both variables point in the way that we've hypothesized that we have a revolution. So that's a kind of a very bare bones way of getting from a general theory to a testable prediction, a hypothesis, thinking about a couple of variables that we could attach to this specific hypothesis, how we can measure it, and then we come to this beautiful outcome here. I'm sure while you were listening to it, you were holding your head going, why is he doing it that way? That's weird. Why health and wealth? Why 1980? Why 2000 GDP per capita? Why these countries? All legitimate questions, or all legitimate criticisms, and I would invite you to collect as many possible things that have gone wrong in this study as you can, and maybe we can talk about that in the live stream. Now, if you think, though, that my theory is completely without merit, because, I've just made a biased case selection here, that happened to confirm my hypothesis, we can look at happiness around the world here. This is from a study in 2007 where Adrian White made kind of a meta index of happiness. So this actually does include studies that ask people in those countries, how happy are you with your life? And so if we see a world map of happiness here, where are people happy and where are people unhappy, we do see that there seems to be a good bit of correlation between where people are happy and regions where we know that states tend to be fragile and unstable. And one example why this map is a little bit interesting is not only is Europe not all the way happy, there is quite a few people in Europe that like to whine apparently and think that they're not very happy with their life, but there's also a couple of islands of happiness around the world that you might not have expected. We have, for example, the case of Costa Rica down here. Let me just get my laser pointer. Here in Central America, Costa Rica people are extremely happy, even though people around them aren't necessarily super happy. And maybe an even more blatant case here is this. I'm assuming you know what this country is. It is Bhutan, which is surrounded by actually pretty unhappy places, and yet the people of Bhutan are extremely happy. There's a fun fact about Bhutan is that their government collects not the gross domestic product, so not an economic factor, to measure its progress, but it collects gross national happiness. It is actually trying to quantify how happy its people are, and at least according to this one study, that policy seems to work. There is a couple more complexities to that specific case, but anyway, Bhutan, very happy. Now, of course, this is a correlation, right, between the two factors. It seems to be that people are happy where the world is relatively stable, and they seem to be unhappy where the world is unstable. One of the things that you could accuse me of course, is this not reverse causality? It's not that people first are unhappy and then they destabilize their countries. It is that their countries are unstable and therefore they are unhappy. So in other words, have I not just done essentially a satisfaction with life versus butter study? So what we see in this wonderful graph here is that we can graph the average self-reported happiness, how satisfied are you with your life, with how much butter do you get per capita. And so maybe what I've found out here is a classic case of reverse causality or just a spurious correlation. Now, if you want to think about this for more than 1 second though, I invite you to think why it could be that countries that have a lot of butter per person are also happier, and why this goes the other way around too. So there's a couple of pitfalls, of course, even when we do comparative politics and even when we compare things across the world. So enough of that, let's get into somewhat more concrete things that have to do with the comparative politics stuff that you were probably expecting. So I just want to illustrate how many different ways you have here in comparative politics to set up a study on the same empirical phenomenon or a similar empirical phenomenon. So let's say you want to conduct a study on voting and you want to do that in a comparative way. Then you have to first settle a few things. You have to first think about what is your dependent variable actually going to be. Most often, probably, studies on voting are about two things. They're either about voter turnout, so in this case, how many people are actually turning out to vote? How large is the participation of the society in its own elections, or in the elections of its own political system? And we could have a unit of analysis here that is individual. So we could try to explain why certain people are voting or other people are abstaining, meaning they're not going to vote. Or we could have a unit of analysis that is territorial. So the turnout percentage, for example, between two different parts of the same country or between two countries. Why are people turning out in greater numbers in the one place and not in the other? So voter turnout is the first thing that we could look at when we study voting. Vote choice is probably the first thing you were thinking of. Why are people voting a certain way? Why are people voting for specific parties? So in this case, we are looking at a categorical measure for our dependent variable in terms of which parties that are on the ballot are people actually voting for. Or maybe are they even trying to vote for something that's not on the ballot with write-in candidates and similar things. We could also, as we study voting, though, look at party vote share. So what explains what percentage, what proportion of the total vote specific parties got. So in this case, we have what's called an interval measure. So the percentage of the vote share, or maybe the percentage of elected members that a particular party gets. As you might know already, there are certain systems where you can get quite a lot of votes, but actually have no one elected to parliament, for example. This sometimes happens in first-past-the-post systems. You can have a lot of votes in each given constituency, but if you don't have the majority, you're not going to get that member of parliament. So there could be a discrepancy there. And the last thing then we can think of when we study voting is which party actually comes out on top? Which party then holds government office? Are parties in government after an election, or are they in opposition? Or if we want to split it up even a little bit further, can parties form a single party government? Do they have to have a coalition partner? Are they in the opposition, or are they not even in parliament in total? So if we do a comparative study on voting, if voting is your topic that you're interested in, you're not done, because you can then have a dependent variable that goes into a lot of different directions. Are you worried about turnout, about choice, about vote share, or maybe about government office? Turning to the other side of voting, maybe you're not actually interested in just the dependent variable side of voting. Maybe you are interested in the independent variable side of voting. So what determines how people vote, for example? And so I've given you a little menu here of possible independent variables that you could be looking at. When you think about what makes people vote a certain way, are you naturally drawn towards trying to explain things with individual attitudes? So it's just how individuals are thinking about specific parties, about their specific policies, or maybe how competent they believe those parties or party leaders maybe are. So are people making the sort of more or less rational choice? They are looking at party programs and they're deciding, well, this is the best one for me. Or is vote choice very much predicated on your social class, your gender, your educational achievement, your ethnicity, or any kinds of your age maybe? So are these actually the factors that drive you to vote in a specific way? Is it whether or not you identify with a party? Is it whether or not you have a certain ideology or certain issue positions that drive you to make a certain vote choice? Does it actually matter how well the party did before? So in most cases, it's not that a party gets 3% at the one national election and 86% at the next national election and then 7% at the election after that. It tends to be that success at the previous election is probably a pretty good indicator of how well you're going to do in the next. That doesn't mean you always get the same vote share, but those things are not independent of each other. Does it matter, for example, in terms of how many votes parties are getting, the leadership of the party is structured? Does it matter whether the leader has charisma, whatever that is? Does it mean that other qualities of candidates, such as their age, their gender, their ethnicity, their personal views, their family situation, their gender identity, whatever, does that influence whether or not people are voting for them? Does it matter for the outcome of elections how campaigns are financed or how they are run, how professional they are run maybe? And then we have a whole bunch of intervening variables that could also come into play when we study voting or voting outcomes in this case. What role does the media play? How they explain things, how they frame certain things, and what role, for example, does the electoral system play, which we'll have an entire lecture on, of course, later on in the course. So you see here that when we think about one specific issue that we want to approach with a comparative lens, we can actually make a ton of additional choices about what exactly it is that we're studying, both on the side of the dependent and the independent variables. The next thing that we then have to tackle as we do our comparative politics research design is case selection. This is something that will be really difficult and really important for you, for example, as you tackle sometimes longer essays, even the essays in this particular course, or when you then go on and write your dissertation. So what is the territorial scale? What are we comparing? If, say, we want to compare voter turnout, are we comparing this on the continent level, like are voters in Asia more likely to turn out than voters in Europe, for example? Are we looking at macro regions like Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, Northern Africa versus Sub-Saharan Africa versus Saharan Africa? Are we looking at states, at regions, or even at municipalities? Because sometimes we can have quite large differences there. And the main question that we have to answer in this case is, how many cases do we actually compare? Are we taking single cases? Careful, because we are doing comparative politics, so we shouldn't just do single cases, but there is a way of doing it. Are we using small n research designs, so a small number of cases, which means that we can go much more in depth, even though we might not have the breadth in our design? Or are we approaching it from a large n perspective? Do we want to cover as many cases as possible, and we might want to sacrifice a little bit of depth because we really want to cover as many countries, for example, as we can? Oftentimes this requires you to use statistical analysis. I've left out sort of the temporal scale because that's also something we normally have to look at. Are we, for example, taking a snapshot of the current voter turnout, or are we looking at voter turnout over the past 40 years or something and comparing that then also across cases? So generally speaking, we can divide research designs up into research designs that are stronger case-oriented versus ones that are stronger variable-oriented. And this roughly corresponds to small n studies versus large n studies. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's go through those things really quickly because that will serve as your basis to evaluate a lot of other studies that you read on this course on specific issues. So whenever you read research in comparative politics, always try to work out first what their approach is here. Are they taking a single case, small n, or large n approach? So let's go into a couple of examples here. So B. Guy Peters reminds us that anytime a researcher investigates a single instance of a phenomenon within a single setting, that is a case study. Lijphart points out that if you only look at one case and you take a mostly descriptive perspective on it, that's not comparative politics. So just pointing out, this is how the UK political system works, this is how the Scottish political system works, that's obviously not comparative politics yet. But you can introduce comparative elements into single case study. So, for example, you can use a single case study to generate hypotheses or generate even whole theories with the intent to then apply these to other cases. And that is actually the way that lots of the theories are arrived at, is that people take a single case, they're working out how things are related here, and then they try to extrapolate from that one case to others and generalize things. Maybe you also found in a larger N study an individual case that really stuck out and, for example, doesn't really confirm your theory. And then that's what's called a deviant case study. So you've compared 100 countries, one of them is a major outlier on the variables that you're looking at, and then maybe that merits a single case study because you came at it with a comparative mindset. One actual example of this is, again, Lijphart, who is sort of one of the godfathers of comparative politics. He published a study in 1968 called The Politics of Accommodation, Pluralism and Democracy in the Netherlands. And he studied a specific type of democracy that he called consociational democracy. And the interesting aspect about the Netherlands here was that it was a deviant case study. It was a society that was really deeply divided, especially around religious lines, but also along ethnic lines. And the question that Lijphart has was, why does this not create constant instability? Why is the Dutch state actually so stable if there are such deep societal divisions? Arguably a question that is still really relevant today, because if anything we're looking for today is ways to keep states stable even when certain groups in the population really disagree with each other. And what he found in his specific case study here is that much of what kept the Netherlands stable was the behavior of elites. So the elites, the political elites and the societal elites, that included religious elites, they were working together. They understood the value of cooperation and they understood the importance of keeping the state stable and reinforcing certain norms, and that then also kept society as a whole stable. So he identified the really crucial role that elites could play in stabilizing a state. That is something that today almost sounds a little bit quaint, and actually almost only 10 years later he published the next study that talked about how the system seemed to be on the way out because the kind of consensus between societal elites seemed to break down. Now, why is this relevant for comparative politics? Well, it's because he developed categories, concepts, and a theory here with the intention to then apply them to other contexts. So he was doing theory building in a deviant case that he could then use to maybe also explain consociational democracy in other places. So again, this is a single case study. Let's make an example for a small n study. So small n case studies tend to be the ones you see most often. They are case oriented, so you picked very specific cases for specific reasons, and you want to identify similarities and differences between those. So if you have a lot of countries, for example, that all have really good economic outcomes or that all have really high voter turnouts, what are the commonalities between those? What explains why, for example, very different countries all have high voter turnouts? And the good thing about this is that you have a limited number of explanations. You keep your case number fairly small. So ideally, you don't have to worry about, 17 possible factors that could all explain that, because you are only worried about a specific number of factors for each case. So in essence, it allows us to go into more depth in each case, so we can do a more focused comparison. We can give the historical context adequate space, and we can also think about what makes each case unique. So what are the idiosyncrasies of each case that could contribute to the outcome? So essentially, it is a case design that prioritizes depth over breadth. There's also, of course, a couple of disadvantages that come with it, because if we only look at a small number of cases, maybe we actually can't generalize our results to other cases. Maybe there's just too many variables going on. You can't test 10 different variables in 3 cases. You're just going to be overwhelmed by this. And you can't properly establish which variable was actually in the end responsible for the outcome. And of course, we run the risk of a biased case selection. So have you, for example, picked your cases specifically for the reason that they support your initial expectation or hypothesis? So whenever you see a study published that picks a small number of cases that all slightly suspiciously, support the initial hypothesis, you might want to look again at how those cases were picked and if there was a case logic that goes beyond just I want to present the thing that proves me right. You might want to go back to my case selection in my example earlier about the happy piece and make a similar point. Now, the empirical example for this is Michael Keating's Nations Against the State. This is a really important book published in 1996. And it is a classic case of a small n case study, because what he does is he picks 3 countries and he analyzes the dynamics of sub-state nationalism. So in this case, he picks Canada, Spain, and the UK. In other words, the sub-state nationalist movements of Quebec, Catalonia, and Scotland. And what he wants to do is he wants to chart the historical, cultural, economic, and political factors that contribute to these demands. And the idea is that he looks at these specific cases because they are arguably the ones that are furthest advanced, that have the most kind of vibrant, most politically powerful independence or nationalist movements. That's not to say that there's not other nationalist movements around the world, but he picks the ones that he believes are the ones that are most interesting and most pertinent from a political science perspectives. So in this case, it is they are the most notable cases among a broader phenomenon. Now, lastly, after talking about single case and small n case studies, let's come to the large n case studies. And this is the classic, what's also called a variable-based approach, because we care much less about the individual cases and we care much more about the variables that we can look at across a large number of cases. Normally, these studies are quantitative, so they use statistics and numbers, and we test for a large number of possible causes that might be correlated to our dependent variable. Now, this can both use individual level and aggregate level data, so we can use countries, we can use continents, or however we aggregate our data. But the general logic behind this is always the same. It is that generality is more important than complexity. So we're not so much interested in the idiosyncrasies, the unique qualities of each individual case. We just want to get the most general possible explanation that fits the largest number of cases. So we sacrifice depth to achieve breadth. The advantages that has is that we can generalize really easily. If we do find a factor that does play a role for the dependent variable in a large number of cases, then we can be pretty sure that there is actually something going on. If we just find one factor being correlated with the dependent variable in 3 cases, let's say 3 countries out of 193, then we probably aren't quite as sure about that. We can control for rival explanations, so we can test our explanation versus others. We can identify outliers better, because once we've looked at, say, 100 countries, we know exactly which countries adhere to our explanations and which ones deviate from it. And we can theory build based on which factors we actually notice are correlated with our dependent variable. There's obviously disadvantages to this. I mean, you will see this when you read statistical studies, is that obviously there's not a lot of detail about any one given case. And it just means that these studies sometimes can be a little dry. They can be a little shallow, maybe, because, again, what you're looking for is generality rather than specificity. And maybe the explanations that we come up with are valid, so we do find that one factor is related to another, but they're also a bit shallow because sometimes we just find that there is a correlation, but we actually don't have a very good idea of why that correlation is happening. A real-world example of a comparative politics study that utilizes a large N approach is the World Values Survey. And what these guys do is they send out questionnaires to all kinds of countries all around the world, in all world regions, and they actually ask people, so individuals in those countries, specific questions about their values and their beliefs. And once you've done that, so one question is here on the right, for example, that asks individuals how important politics is in their life. Now, you might have some ideas about where in the world you would think politics are more important than in other places. Maybe you have some idea about, poverty, maybe. If you're very poor, maybe you care less about politics, but maybe that's not actually true because you understand the what politics maybe could be able to do for you. In this particular case, I've given you 4 countries here: China, Germany, Japan, and Tunisia. And these are the results when you ask individuals in these countries. Ignoring these, the 2 columns on the right-hand side, you can see that actually a minority of people is at the extremes. So not at all important. That's not a statement that a lot of people ascribe to. But on the other hand, not very many people find politics very important. Actually, in China and Germany, it's almost the same value, where only 10% of people believe that politics is important in their own life. And the not very important category is actually the largest one. And again, it might be slightly interesting that China and Germany, 2 extremely different political systems with very different democratic values and values of participation, actually score almost identically in this category with like 42 to 46% or something. And the country where people actually believe that politics is most important in their life is Japan out of those 4. I don't know if you've expected that or not, but it's an interesting result. Once you've collected all these results then from this large end study, you can really get to work on finding really large scale general explanations and general hypotheses about the world. And you see one of those on the left hand side here. So if you look at this graph, what's being done here is they've taken essentially 2 dimensions, and these dimensions consist, I think, of the scores on a number of different questions. But this axis here, this charts whether the individuals in this country subscribe to what the World Values Survey thinks is traditional values versus secular rational values. If you want to be a little bit normative and biased, you can say modern values, but that's probably unfair to the people in those other countries. Now, I'm not going to get into detail whether that's a good measure or not, just that at least with the World Values Survey, with that data, we can chart the world here with these. So traditional values versus secular rational values. And at the bottom, whether people are mostly concerned with survival as a element of their own life, or whether self-expression takes a larger role in their own life. And we can see that the world kind of is fairly neatly divided into these slightly weirdly shaped blobs. So you see, for example, Protestant Europe up here with the Scandinavian countries and Germany that all score very highly on self-expression and that supposedly embody a lot of secular rational values. While on the other hand, you have the traditional societies where survival is more important, which are mostly in the Middle East and Africa. And you see also that some world regions are kind of between the chairs. So South Asia, for example, is kind of in the middle, where that they seem to be in transition, maybe from one end of the spectrum into the next. So that's the kind of stuff you can do with large and quantitative data. And of course, this loses all depth. You just have a dot for Japan here, which is nice because you can compare Japan to all other countries in this particular graph, but it also tells you nothing about Japan as a case. So again, advantages and disadvantages here. Now, to sum all this up, comparative politics, we've said, looks for patterns across time and across space, and we do try to generate theories based on the patterns that we see. We try to generate general explanations about why things happen. So the puzzles that we see, why are things a certain way in the one place and why are things another way in another place, those are intrinsically linked to theories. We always have to understand what our dependent and independent variables are, regardless of how explicit the original authors are. We need to be aware of how this works. And one of the main questions really that you always have to answer first in comparative politics and in comparative politics research designs is which cases do you want to look at and how many of them do you think you need to cover? And then, of course, as a second step, which aspects of them do you want to compare? So that was a little run through after the why. Why do we even have to compare? Now we come to the how and the what. And then we'll take this another step further with the next lecture by my colleague Carlo Basta next week that will look at specific comparative politics research designs. Thanks very much for sticking with me so far, and I will see you next week.